What if I told you that the most brilliant military strategy of the entire Pacific War wasn't about fighting the Japanese at all? It was about ignoring them completely, deliberately leaving over 100,000 enemy soldiers alive, armed, and sitting in their jungle fortresses, while American forces sailed right past them and never looked back. That decision, made by one admiral sitting in a Hawaii headquarters building, changed the entire course of World War II in the Pacific. And almost nobody knows the full story of how it worked, why it worked, and just how badly it humiliated one of the most formidable military machines the world had ever seen. Today, we are going to break down the island-hopping strategy in a way that most history channels never do. Not just the famous battles, not just the flag raisings and the naval engagements, but the actual strategic genius behind the thinking, the psychology, the cold calculation, and the devastating humiliation that Japan's military leadership had to sit with as they watched their carefully constructed defensive network get turned into an expensive, elaborate joke. So let us start at the beginning, because to understand why island hopping was genius, you first have to understand how catastrophically things were going for the United States before it existed. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan moved with terrifying speed and efficiency. Within months, they had seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and countless island chains across the Pacific. The Japanese military had spent years building what they called their defensive perimeter, a vast network of fortified islands stretching from the Aleutians in the north, down through the central Pacific, past the Marianas and the Carolines, all the way to the southwest Pacific. The idea was simple and genuinely brilliant on its face. If the Americans wanted to get close enough to attack the Japanese home islands, they would have to fight their way through thousands of miles of ocean, assaulting one fortified island after another, bleeding themselves dry one beach at a time. Japanese military planners believed this would make any American offensive so costly in men and resources that eventually the United States would negotiate a peace settlement rather than face the prospect of annihilating casualties. And here is the thing. That plan was not crazy. It actually made a lot of sense, given what Japan knew about American political culture, American casualty sensitivity, and the sheer logistics of projecting military force halfway across the world. If the United States had actually tried to storm every single Japanese-held island in the Pacific in sequence, the war might have taken a decade and cost millions of American lives. But Japan made one enormous miscalculation. They assumed the Americans would fight on Japanese terms. Enter Chester Nimitz. Nimitz was not the flashiest American commander of World War II. He did not have Douglas MacArthur's theatrical ego or William Halsey's swaggering aggression. He was quiet, methodical, intensely analytical, and possessed of a kind of strategic patience that his Japanese counterparts fundamentally did not understand. When Nimitz was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, just days after Pearl Harbor, he inherited a disaster. The battleship fleet was wrecked, morale was shattered, and the Japanese seemed unstoppable. But Nimitz did not panic. He sat down, looked at the maps, studied Japanese logistics and supply lines, and began asking a question that nobody else was really asking yet. What if we just went around them? The strategic concept that would become known as island hopping, or more formally as leapfrogging, grew out of a fundamental insight about how island fortifications actually work. A fortified island is only valuable if it can be supplied and reinforced. Cut off an island garrison from resupply, and all those soldiers, all those guns, all those fortifications, they become completely worthless. They cannot attack you. They cannot influence the campaign. They simply exist, trapped, consuming their own supplies, slowly becoming irrelevant. The island does not need to be captured, it just needs to be isolated. This insight sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but actually acting on it, actually having the discipline to sail past fortified positions full of tens of thousands of armed enemy soldiers and just leave them there, that required a kind of strategic nerve that very few commanders in history have possessed. Nimitz possessed it. The practical application of this strategy required three key elements working together. First, American naval and air superiority to cut off the bypassed islands from resupply. Second, a willingness to accept that some isolated garrisons might try to break out or cause problems, and having enough confidence in your defensive perimeter to handle that risk. Third, and most critically, the ability to correctly identify which islands actually mattered strategically, and which ones were just expensive real estate that the Japanese happened to be sitting on. This third element is where the real genius came in, because not every island in the Pacific was worth taking. Nimitz and his planners had to look at the Pacific like a chessboard and identify the squares that actually controlled the game. They needed islands that could support airfields capable of reaching the next target. They needed islands that had harbors suitable for fleet anchorage. They needed islands positioned to cut Japanese supply lines rather than just sitting out in empty ocean. Everything else could be ignored. Let us talk about how this played out in practice, because the actual campaign reveals just how devastatingly effective the strategy was. The turning point really came in 1943 and into 1944. After the brutal attritional fighting in the Solomons and at Guadalcanal, where the United States had essentially fought the Japanese on their terms and paid dearly for it, Nimitz began to implement the leapfrogging approach more aggressively. The first major showcase of the strategy came in the Central Pacific Campaign, beginning in late 1943. Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands had to be taken because they were the gateway into the Marshalls and the broader Central Pacific. Those fights were brutal, and nobody pretends otherwise. But what happened next was the real demonstration of strategic genius. When Nimitz moved into the Marshall Islands in early 1944, rather than assaulting the heavily fortified outer islands where Japan had concentrated its defenses, American forces bypassed places like Wacha, Maloelap, Jaluit, and Mille entirely. These islands collectively held thousands of Japanese troops, significant gun emplacements, and had been prepared for exactly the kind of assault that never came. Instead, American forces went straight for Kwajalein and Eniwetok, the key atolls in the Marshalls that provided the anchorages and airfields needed for the next phase of operations. The bypassed islands were simply subjected to periodic air bombardment to keep the garrisons suppressed and neutralized. The Japanese soldiers on those atolls would spend the rest of the war there, slowly starving, unable to influence anything. But the single most dramatic demonstration of island-hopping genius came with the decision regarding Truk. Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands was, at that point in the war, perhaps the single most important Japanese naval base in the entire Pacific. It was called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and that description was not exaggeration. Truk sat at the center of Japan's defensive network, served as the primary base for the combined fleet, and was so heavily fortified that American planners had initially assumed any assault on it would be catastrophically costly. Some estimates suggested storming Truk could cost more American lives than almost any other operation in the Pacific War. Nimitz bypassed it entirely. In early 1944, American carrier aircraft launched a devastating two-day raid on Truk, Operation Hailstone, sinking enormous amounts of shipping and destroying hundreds of aircraft. But rather than following up with an invasion, American forces simply isolated Truk, cut its supply lines, and moved on toward the Marianas. The massive Japanese garrison on Truk, which had been considered a strategic asset of incalculable value, became overnight just another collection of hungry, stranded soldiers waiting for a relief that would never come. The Japanese military leadership's reaction to this was, in its own way, deeply revealing. They had built Truk up as an impregnable fortress. They had invested enormous resources in its fortification. And then, the Americans just decided it was not worth capturing and sailed around it. The humiliation was not just military, it was philosophical. The entire defensive perimeter strategy was predicated on the assumption that the Americans would have to fight for every island. When the Americans demonstrated they could simply choose which islands to fight for and which to ignore, The entire strategic concept collapsed. Now, I want to take a moment here to really drill into the psychological dimension of this, because I think it is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the Pacific War. Japanese military culture in World War II placed enormous emphasis on the concept of fighting to the last man, on never surrendering, on the idea that dying in battle was honorable and surrender was disgraceful. These values had genuine military advantages in some contexts. Japanese garrisons fought with extraordinary ferocity and made American assaults horrifically costly whenever the Americans did choose to attack. But island hopping turned these same values into a devastating liability. When a Japanese garrison was bypassed, they could not simply walk away. They could not fall back to a new defensive line. They were on an island. They had nowhere to go. And because their military culture forbade surrender, they had only two options. Either they waited to be relieved, which was not going to happen, or they died where they stood. So they waited, and waited, and slowly starved while the Americans prosecuted their campaign hundreds of miles away. Some of these garrisons held out with incredible tenacity under conditions of unimaginable hardship. There are accounts of Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands growing their own food, manufacturing their own equipment from salvage, and maintaining military organization and discipline years after the strategic situation had become completely hopeless. In a certain light, this is remarkable. But from a purely strategic standpoint, it changed absolutely nothing. These men, however brave and disciplined, were simply not participants in the war anymore. They had been removed from the board without the Americans having to pay the price of a direct assault. Consider the numbers for a moment, because the scale of what was bypassed is genuinely staggering. By the end of the Pacific War, Japanese forces stranded on bypassed islands and positions numbered in the hundreds of thousands of troops. Some estimates put the figure at over 300,000 Japanese soldiers who were effectively removed from the war without ever being directly defeated in a major land engagement. All those men, all those guns, all those fortifications, completely neutralized. The investment Japan had made in building its defensive perimeter essentially evaporated because of a strategic concept that, at its core, was simply about choosing not to attack. Let us talk about the logistics side of this, because island hopping was not just a clever idea, it was an incredibly complex logistical achievement that often gets overlooked. Moving a major military force across the Pacific in the 1940s was not like moving an army across Europe. There were no roads, no railways, no existing infrastructure. Everything, food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, had to be shipped across thousands of miles of ocean and then brought ashore on beaches that were, until very recently, heavily defended. The United States developed an entirely new approach to mobile logistics during the Pacific Campaign, the idea of the mobile naval base that could support operations far from any permanent shore facility. This mobile logistical capability was actually a critical enabler of island hopping. The reason American forces could bypass heavily fortified positions and still keep advancing was that they did not depend on those positions for their own supply chain. The Japanese defensive strategy assumed that capturing certain key bases would be necessary because any attacking force would need them as logistics nodes. American engineering ingenuity and industrial production effectively negated that assumption by creating logistics capabilities that could function without those permanent bases. The Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, deserve enormous credit here. These were the units that arrived on newly captured islands and within days or weeks had constructed airfields, harbor facilities, fuel storage, and all the infrastructure needed to support the next phase of operations. The speed at which American forces could transform a captured atoll from a battlefield into a functioning military base was something Japanese planners had genuinely not anticipated and could not match. Now let us talk about the Marianas campaign, because this is where island hopping delivered its most strategically consequential result. By June 1944, American forces were ready to assault Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas Islands. The importance of this operation cannot be overstated. The Marianas were close enough to the Japanese home islands that the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal, could reach Tokyo and the Japanese industrial heartland from airfields there. Capturing the Marianas would bring the strategic bombing campaign directly to Japan's doorstep, in a way that would prove devastating to Japanese war production and civilian morale. The Japanese understood this perfectly. The defense of the Marianas was a different kind of fight from those bypassed atolls. This was a position that had to be contested, and Japan committed enormous naval resources to defending it, resulting in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, which American aviators would nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation, already severely weakened by years of attrition, was essentially destroyed as a fighting force in that engagement. American carrier pilots shot down Japanese aircraft at a ratio that left Japanese naval air power permanently crippled. And this outcome was itself a product of the island-hopping strategy. Because American forces had bypassed and isolated so many Japanese positions along the way, by the time Japan had to commit its remaining air power to defending the Marianas, it was facing an American naval force that had been able to conserve its strength and build its capabilities rather than grinding itself down in costly sequential assaults. The fall of Saipan was so shocking to Japanese leadership that it led directly to the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and the collapse of his cabinet. The Japanese government had told its people that the Marianas were impregnable. When those islands fell, the credibility of Japan's military leadership suffered a blow from which it never truly recovered. I want to step back here and address something that sometimes comes up when people discuss island hopping, which is the question of whether this strategy was entirely Nimitz's invention, or whether other people deserve credit too. The honest answer is that strategic concepts of this kind rarely have a single inventor. The idea of bypassing fortified positions has a history going back centuries in military thought. In the Pacific specifically, there were parallel debates happening simultaneously in the Southwest Pacific Theater under General Douglas MacArthur, whose own operations also incorporated leapfrogging principles, most famously in New Guinea. MacArthur and Nimitz actually had significant command disputes during the war about the best approach to the Pacific campaign, and the historical record shows that the leapfrogging concept was discussed and argued over at multiple levels of American military planning. But Nimitz deserves specific credit for the way he applied the strategy in the Central Pacific with consistent discipline and for the crucial early decisions that set the pattern. His willingness to bypass Truk specifically represented a level of strategic boldness that was not universally shared among American planners. There were significant voices arguing that Truk had to be captured. Nimitz's judgment that isolating it was sufficient was one of the genuinely consequential individual decisions of the entire war. Now let us think about what the Japanese experience of all this actually looked like from the other side, because this is where the humiliation angle really becomes vivid. Imagine you are a Japanese garrison commander on one of the bypassed atolls in the Marshalls or the Carolines. You have spent months or years overseeing the construction of fortifications. Your men have dug miles of tunnels, emplaced artillery, built bunkers designed to survive American bombardment, trained and prepared for the American assault that the High Command has assured you is coming. Your defensive position is genuinely formidable. An American landing on your island would cost them dearly. And then you listen to your radio, and you hear that American forces have landed somewhere completely different. Not on your island. They have skipped you. The supply ships stop coming. Aircraft stop flying in from the rear. You send radio messages asking what is happening, and the responses become increasingly sparse and then stop altogether. Your stockpiles slowly shrink. You start rationing food. You watch the horizon for the relief convoy that never appears. Months pass. You hear on the radio, if your radio still functions, that battles are occurring hundreds of miles away. The Americans are in the Marianas now. They are in the Philippines. The war has moved completely beyond you and your garrison, and your carefully prepared island fortress that nobody ever bothered to attack. All that preparation, all that engineering, all that sacrifice and hardship and military discipline, and it has made absolutely no difference to the outcome of anything. That is the humiliation of island hopping. Not just the strategic defeat, though that was total. It was the specific quality of the defeat. Japan was not overcome through superior fighting at the positions they had chosen. They were overcome through superior thinking that simply rendered those positions irrelevant. There is a difference between being beaten and being made to feel foolish, and island hopping delivered both simultaneously. Some of the isolated garrisons continued to receive occasional supply by submarine, but this was a trickle compared to what they needed.
The Japanese submarine force, never as large or as well deployed as the American submarine force, had its own problems dealing with American anti-submarine efforts. The cruel irony is that while Japanese submarines were sometimes risking their crews to bring rice and medicine to stranded island garrisons, American submarines were systematically destroying the Japanese merchant fleet that carried raw materials to Japan's home island factories. The strategic exchange could not have been more lopsided. Let us also give appropriate credit to the American submarine campaign, because it worked in concert with island hopping to strangle Japan's strategic position in a way that the island fortification strategy had simply never accounted for. Japan in 1941 was almost entirely dependent on imports for the raw materials needed to sustain its war economy. Oil, rubber, iron ore, bauxite, all of it came by sea from the territories Japan had seized in Southeast Asia. The Japanese defensive perimeter was designed to protect these sea lanes by maintaining air and naval superiority over the island chains surrounding them. What this strategy did not adequately address was the threat from submarines operating beneath those island barriers. American submarines, operating primarily out of Pearl Harbor and later from captured bases in the Marianas and elsewhere, prosecuted an increasingly devastating campaign against Japanese merchant shipping throughout the war. By 1944 and 1945, Japan's ability to move raw materials from its conquered territories to its home island factories had been catastrophically degraded. Oil supplies became critically short. Aircraft could not fly, ships could not sail. Factories began to run short of the materials they needed to maintain production. Island hopping and the submarine campaign were strategically complementary.
As American forces pushed further west, they captured new bases from which submarines could operate with greater effectiveness and range. The bypassed garrisons on isolated islands could not interfere with submarine operations. The isolation of those garrisons themselves demonstrated American control of the sea lanes. Every aspect of the strategy reinforced every other aspect. Japan had built a strategy around the idea of making the Pacific too costly for America to cross. America answered by building a strategy around the idea of making Japan's defensive investment worthless. And the American answer was simply, decisively, the right one. Now I want to talk about what lessons from this story actually transcend the specific military context, because there is something here that goes beyond World War II history. The fundamental insight of island hopping is essentially about the difference between strength and relevance. Japan had genuine military strength. Its island garrisons were genuinely formidable fighting forces. The soldiers were well trained, well armed, and prepared to fight to the death. That strength was real. But Nimitz's strategy made that strength irrelevant by denying it an opportunity to be applied. A fortress that nobody attacks is not a military asset. It is just an expensive building full of hungry people. This principle shows up in many different contexts. In business strategy, the equivalent is when a competitor makes an enormous investment in a particular market position and then discovers that the market has moved somewhere else and their investment cannot be transferred. The investment was real, the capability was real, but the relevance evaporated. All that preparedness, all that capital, all that organizational energy directed at defending a position that the competition simply chose not to contest.
The deeper strategic lesson is about the difference between responding to your opponent's strategy and forcing your opponent to respond to yours. Japan built its Pacific defensive perimeter as a response to American power, specifically as an attempt to make American power too expensive to project. Nimitz's island hopping turned that logic inside out by designing a strategy that Japan's defensive preparations had no answer for. Japan was now responding to the Americans, not the other way around. And Japan, constrained by its own military culture, its supply line vulnerabilities, its inability to match American industrial production, and the specific geography of its defensive choices, found that it had very few good responses available to it. Each island-hopping operation presented Japan with impossible choices. Commit the fleet to defend the target island and risk losing the fleet in an engagement where American advantages had grown overwhelming. Or abandon the island's garrison to their fate and watch the defensive perimeter shrink further. Japan mostly chose to fight major fleet actions only when it judged the stakes high enough, and it lost badly in those engagements. The Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. Each fleet battle further degraded Japan's ability to influence the campaign, and the bypassed garrisons kept sitting on their islands, doing nothing, eating nothing, changing nothing. It is also worth taking a moment to appreciate just how much the specific character of Chester Nimitz mattered to all of this. Strategic concepts do not implement themselves. Somebody had to make the specific decisions, take the specific risks, absorb the specific criticism that came from choosing to bypass rather than attack. There were always voices, in Washington, in the field, among the public, asking why these Japanese positions were being left behind. Were they a threat? Could they be reinforced? Was it safe to leave them? Nimitz had to maintain his confidence in the strategy through all of that pressure. And he did. His calm, analytical temperament, his willingness to look at strategic logic rather than emotional or political pressures, and his ability to manage the complex command relationships involved in a theatre as vast and complicated as the Pacific, were all essential to making island hopping work in practice rather than just in theory. There is also something to be said about the intelligence dimension. Nimitz and American planners benefited enormously from communications intelligence, from the breaking of Japanese naval codes, which gave them insights into Japanese defensive dispositions, supply situations, and fleet movements that Japan did not know they possessed. The ability to correctly identify which islands were truly critical strategic targets and which were essentially empty investments in the wrong real estate was substantially enhanced by this intelligence advantage. Nimitz could afford to bypass certain positions, partly because he had good reason to believe they could not be effectively reinforced, or that their garrisons were weaker than their fortifications suggested. This intelligence advantage was itself the product of enormous American institutional investment in cryptanalysis, going back to the late 1930s and intensifying dramatically after Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, where American forces ambushed the Japanese carrier strike force, thanks to foreknowledge of Japanese plans, had already demonstrated what good intelligence could do for Pacific strategy. Island hopping built on that foundation. As 1944 turned to 1945, the strategic logic of island hopping reached its ultimate conclusion. American forces were now in the Marianas. B-29 bombers were striking Japanese cities. The American submarine campaign had brought Japanese industrial production to its knees. American naval power roamed the Western Pacific, essentially at will. Japan's home islands were being systematically destroyed from the air, and hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops sat on bypassed islands in the Pacific, still armed, still alive, still militarily disciplined, and completely, entirely, irreversibly irrelevant to everything that was happening. The men who had built Japan's defensive perimeter strategy were not stupid. They had designed a genuine strategic concept based on real geographic and logistical realities. But they had been outthought. Their assumptions had been invalidated not through brute force, but through creative strategic thinking that identified the weakness at the heart of their plan and exploited it mercilessly. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war, there were still Japanese garrisons scattered across the Pacific on bypassed islands. Some of these soldiers did not even believe the surrender announcement was genuine when it came. Several continued to resist for months or even years afterward, the most famous being Hiro Onoda in the Philippines, who did not accept the surrender until 1974, when his original commanding officer flew to the jungle to personally deliver the order. These holdouts are often presented as stories of extraordinary loyalty and tenacity, and in human terms, there is something genuinely moving about that level of commitment to duty. But in strategic terms, they are the perfect final illustration of what island hopping achieved. Men still fighting a war that ended decades earlier, still defending positions that nobody was attacking, still embodying the logical endpoint of a defensive strategy that had been rendered completely pointless by an American admiral's decision to simply go around it. Chester Nimitz died in 1966, having outlived the victory he helped create by more than 20 years. He was not the kind of man who left behind dramatic memoirs or sought the spotlight. His strategic achievement was, in its own way, as quiet and methodical as his personality. Not the heroism of a beachhead assault or the drama of a great naval battle, though those things happened under his command. The deepest genius was in the decision not to fight, in the choice to look at 100,000 armed men on a fortified island and say, "They cannot hurt us if we do not go there. So we will not go there, and we will win the war anyway." That is the lesson. That is the real story of island hopping, not just a clever military tactic, not just a footnote in Pacific War history. A fundamental demonstration of what strategic intelligence looks like when it is applied without ego, without the need to prove toughness by fighting every fight, without the weakness of being provoked into your enemy's preferred engagement on your enemy's chosen ground.
Japan built the most elaborate trap in naval history. Chester Nimitz looked at it, nodded, and walked around it. And that, more than any single battle, more than any specific piece of technology or raw American industrial output, is why Japan lost the Pacific War. The next time you hear someone talking about military genius in World War II, remember this. The greatest move Nimitz ever made was the one he chose not to make. The battles he declined to fight. The islands he decided were not worth American blood. Because sometimes the smartest thing a commander can do is exactly that. Nothing. And leave the enemy sitting in their perfect fortress, perfectly prepared for a fight that is never going to come, while history moves on without them.